everyone. For this section, we are going to talk about bioaccumulation and biomagnification. We'll talk about what each of those are, how they're slightly different from each other, and we'll give examples of them as well. Bioaccumulation is the selective absorption and concentration of elements or compounds by cells in a living organism. Most commonly bioaccumulated are fat-soluble compounds. So we talked about POPs already, persistent organic pollutants. These tend to be fat-soluble, and methylmercury or other POPs like DDT, for example, those don't dissolve easily in water. They don't enter the blood very easily for that reason, and they don't leave the body in urine easily. Fun fact, the urine in your body is actually produced from your blood. So kidneys filter out all of those substances from your blood, and then they leave your body as waste in your urine, which I didn't know up until a year or so ago. So I thought I'd share that one too. So when we're talking about POPs or methylmercury not dissolving in water easily, they're not going to enter the blood easily, and therefore they won't be filtered through the kidneys, which would normally filter out a lot of those toxins. So they don't get excreted from the body as waste. So they build up in fat tissue. This leads to toxins building up to reach higher and higher concentration in the organism over time. So when we're talking about bioaccumulation, we're typically just talking about the toxin building up in a singular organism. Biomagnification, on the other hand, is the increase in concentration of substances that occurs in successively higher trophic levels of a food chain or in a food web. We've talked about this before as well, so this will come up on slides later on in this presentation as well. But the consumers at the top of the food pyramid, or at the top of the food web, I should say, according to the 10% rule, they need to eat a higher amount of food in order to obtain the same amount of energy as those organisms lower on the food chain or food web. Therefore, because they're eating a larger quantity of food, they are going to have a higher exposure to things like POPs or methylmercury that have built up in the fat tissues of the substances, or the organisms that these top level predators are eating. Biomagnification will begin with POPs or methylmercury in sediments or plants in an ecosystem. Specifically, in aquatic ecosystems, we're talking about phytoplankton, which are the base of most marine food webs, and then we have grass as well. So primary consumers like zooplankton, bottom-feeding fish, and insects will take in POPs by eating producers such as phytoplankton and grass, causing POPs to bioaccumulate in their tissues. Secondary consumers will then eat primary consumers, and the POPs are then taken into their tissues. Again, because of the 10% rule, organisms at each successive trophic level need to eat more and more biomass to receive enough energy. This leads to higher and higher concentrations of POPs in their systems over their lifetimes. Large predators like salmon, dolphins, and whales tend to have the highest POP or methylmercury levels in their system. So this is just an example of the biomagnification effect. So the phytoplankton in this case is absorbing PCBs. That phytoplankton is then consumed by zooplankton, and then the herring will eat the zooplankton, and each of these have to eat a larger quantity of organisms to obtain the same amount of energy. The salmon's going to eat the herring, which again, they need to eat a larger amount of herring than the herring needed to eat of the zooplankton to obtain the same amount of energy, because we're losing 10% of our energy as we move up our trophic levels. And then the whale's going to eat the salmon, again at the highest amount here of just food consumed. Therefore, the concentration of the PCBs are going to be greatest in our top level consumers. DDT we've talked about a bunch in this unit. So DDT was banned in many developed nations. It's an insecticide, but it still persists in the sediments of many bodies of water. So again, it is taken in by bottom feeders and zooplankton and biomagnified at higher trophic levels. It reaches the highest concentration in top predators, especially predatory birds like eagles and osprey. This causes the thinning of the eggshells in these birds. So a lot of these POPs are going to be endocrine disruptors, which disrupt hormones and therefore disrupts reproductive capabilities. So in this instance, the DDT caused the shells of these predatory birds too thin, which means that the offspring weren't viable. Those eggs couldn't develop to the point where those baby birds would be able to hatch. This was linked to a massive population decline of the bald eagle in the US, which prompted the passage of the Endangered Species Act, which was ultimately a good thing, but it's unfortunate that the bald eagle population had to decline so severely for the Endangered Species Act to come about. So this is just an example of a normal egg versus an egg with a thinned shell due to DDT exposure. And off to the right, you can see how that DDT concentration biomagnifies going up our food web here, all the way from the water to the zooplankton to small fish to large fish and eventually to our predatory birds. Methylmercury. So mercury by itself isn't terribly toxic or bothersome. It is naturally emitted from volcanoes, but it's also input into the environment anthropogenically by burning coal. It's carried by wind and deposited in water, and this is where the mercury becomes an issue because while in the water, bacteria is going to convert it to toxic methylmercury. The methylmercury is then again taken in by phytoplankton and biomagnified all the way up to higher trophic levels. It reaches the highest concentration in top predators of our aquatic ecosystems like tuna, sharks, and whales. And this methylmercury is a neurotoxicant, meaning it damages the central nervous system of animals. Human exposure to methylmercury and POPs typically comes from eating large predatory fish like tuna and salmon and other seafood, amongst eating other animals like cattle or poultry, what have you. But most of our exposure to methylmercury and POPs comes from consuming animals. The methylmercury and POPs tend to damage the human nervous system, especially that of a developing fetus, and they disrupt the reproductive system as endocrine disruptors. And this is just another example of how mercury enters aquatic ecosystems and then biomagnifies its way up the food chain. That is it for this section. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.